Hello, class. This week we're going to be focusing on topics around this notion of family. As we discussed last week, we talked about gender in terms of this concept that Spillers proposes of ungendering, and her argument about how gendering only becomes known after after uh, gendering only becomes accessible to a subject if they are not enslaved. And many of you did a wonderful job in your analysis of her reading. And in this week, especially, I saw that many of you continue to build off of her concepts. And this week, we're going to be working on this idea of domesticity. As she says, these categories of feminine and masculine, male, female, they were tied to a racial project about property and ownership and white supremacy. So we're going to talk about this week a few things, but I want to quickly go over that. This week, you're going to be reading a piece by titled Sex Itself by Richardson, which we're going to talk a little bit about. This presentation lecture is going to be composed of two sections. One, the history of family and how it relates to feminist scholarship. And then we're going to talk about this notion of abolishing the sex and gender binary. And I do want to note that I have an optional reading for this week. It's called Transgender Chicana Poetics. And for anybody who would like to review this piece, this will also be one of the five uh, book reports that can be submitted. So this is not necessarily a book report, but it is an article that I want you to read and analyze and provide and do a report, like I had mentioned in the previous lecture. There's also a section that I want you to review in terms of terminology. And then the most important part here is that I have posted a midterm study guide. There's three different sections, and really, this is an intense study guide. You do not need to know every single term. And you also might notice that some of the readings or terms on here are not on our course reading list. That's all right. I want you to really focus on just studying the readings that we've engaged with in terms of big concepts and ideas. So that means that you don't necessarily have to remember like exactly the author's name, the date, when it was published, but mostly just like the ideas, the arguments, and how they're going to be, how you're going to use that work to talk about what you've learned in this course so far for your midterm. And for most of you who have reviewed the syllabus and have seen the midterm will be open book, so you can have these study guides available to you. You can have all of your previous response posts available. All that information is available and accessible to you, and you can use it to complete your essay. And the essay is really just going to be one question that asks you to briefly analyze a few um, of the readings in by building an argument in response to the question that I propose. So a lot of you have already been doing that throughout this whole semester excellently. One of the things that I want you to focus on for this exam is to not summarize, because that's not going to be what guarantees you an A. What will guarantee you an A is that you emphasize on building a critical analysis and developing your own arguments about the information you're reading. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out. Like I said, most of you are doing an excellent job with this already. And my only suggestions for those of you who are still struggling with this a little bit is to move away from summarizing and focusing on building your own ideas. So if you are discussing Kimberly Crenshaw's essay, how does her theory of intersectionality impact your ideas about race or gender? And you don't have to focus it on yourself. You can also compare it to another reading. So you could say intersectionality is a useful framework to think about in comparison to Chicanx feminist thought, because both relate. Chicanx thought does not consider this, or that, or something. What you're building an argument here, and this is what the skill that I want you to develop. But like I said, all of you are doing a great job. So that's the midterm study guide. This is available to you. Next week, we will not have a lecture because I want you to just focus on your exam, reviewing your midterm study guide. I will post it on there, but it won't be mandatory for you to review it. I don't want you to have too much on your plate. But let's get right into the lecture. So we're gonna start off with a analysis of how feminist politics have conceptualized this concept of family, how this will later build on to our understanding of bodies, embodiment, and health. As you'll see, all of these course topics continue to build off of each other. So, I like to start off an analysis of this notion of family by looking at the etymology of the word, the history of the word, and studying the origin of the word family, which is famulus, which identified and signified someone's relationship to a servant, or an enslaved person who was forced to work under a system of chattel slavery or a system of indentured servitude. All of these different forms of um, enslavement were considered part of this concept of family. So, really, looking at the history, the word family has an origin about its relation to property and ownership outside of biological ties, or so called biological ties. Latin familia signified household servants and household family, and we commonly refer to our families as a different. This doesn't signify that in contemporary usage, but you can understand how both of these um, origins really speak to a legacy of slavery, and how this might be spoken about or discussed by feminist scholarship and feminist authors. A particular critic and scholar of feminist conceptualizations of family is Patricia Hill Collins, who wrote an essay. She's a sociologist. This essay that she wrote is not available in your readings, but I want you to understand her contributions to this field and how feminists have talked about and politicized this concept of family. Patricia Hill Collins was a sociologist at the University of Maryland. She is the former head of the Department of African American Studies at the University of Cincinnati. She was, and the former president of American Sociological Association (ASA). She's the first African American woman to hold this position, and she's well known for her piece titled "Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment." She is a critical scholar in the field of feminist studies, and she has played a critical role in developing and politicizing this concept of family. She says that this particular contribution is how Black feminism has conceptualized this binary of unpaid labor and mainstream hegemonic feminism. So, we talked a little bit about at the beginning of the course mainstream hegemonic feminism, and hegemonic stands for the dominant force, is the way that white women at the time were conceptualizing not having access to the work sphere, wanting to have access to equal rights that would give them the ability to work outside the domestic space or inside the home. And you'll see throughout this lecture the relationship between inside and outside is also apparent in this concept or in this discussion of the family. So, unpaid labor is labor that is often engaged by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and specifically women of color, trans women of color, emotional labor, um, all forms of labor that are considered to be not worthy of being monetary compensated. So, in other words, um, unpaid labor refers to a lot of motherly duties, um, maintaining of social relationships, uh, maintaining work relationships outside of your job description. These are all sorts of ways that Black women, Indigenous women, and other women of color are particularly vulnerable to being put positioned in situations where their labor is exploited, not compensated, and not even acknowledged as actual labor. We've seen a lot of discussions in the last 5 years in this discussions of labor. A lot of sex worker activists talk about the importance of acknowledging sex work as a form of labor and not viewing it as a social stigma, as a suffering a stance, viewing it as a form of actual labor that needs to be compensated and that requires decriminalization. So, all of these discussions are part of feminist issues, and we see these histories reinvent themselves in contemporary conversations around sex work and around other forms of gendered work. Family values are central to projects of nationalism and national well being. As we've seen throughout different presidential administrations, different political campaigns, different non government organizational approaches to abolishing ICE, to abolishing prison systems, we see that this notion of family is continuously used to mobilize an idea of unity and American values. And this can be thought of throughout different geographies, through a feminist transnational approach, and by analyzing how families and other parts of the globe are utilized for political agendas and for national um, well being. So, those are some of the key things. There's conversations about labor. There's also ways that family is being politicized in relation to nationalism. And also, family is the critical system that produces and maintains gendering structures. And it also is a system that organizes and creates racial ideas and practices and constructions of US national identity. So, who you're born into, what families you're born into, where you are located in relation to your mother's side, your father's side, all of these things play a critical role in the social structure of a society. Family values are imagined traditional ideals. These vary according to cultures, according to genders, different groups and social communities develop different family values. But essential to these systems is a connection of marital and blood ties that who is defined as family is determined in relation to marriage and to biology. So you see again this notion of biological determinism and an emphasis on domesticity as a structure to uphold and manage gender values. Um, to continue, the idea or the ideal perfect idolized family structure is one that consists of a heterosexual couple between a male and a female and is presumed to prioritize biological reproduction. So we see these kind of narratives across different forms of communication, religion, discourse on reproductive rights, anti abortion arguments. We see how the ideal family logic continues to resonate in contemporary politics around abortion, about migration. All of these are critical tropes that are used by different organizations and different political campaigns. This notion of family is also related to this binary of private and public space. Like I said, at the time, white feminist uh, endeavors during the suffragette movement in the 1900s, 1800s, and 19th century, um, a lot of the efforts were to move away from the private sphere into the public sphere. White women at the time no longer wanted to be forced into working inside their homes, and they wanted to have access to working positions outside of the home that would be considered valuable positions to be compensated for, unlike the household activities that were expected of them. And excuse me, this is critical to a lot of discussions about um, Black and Indigenous feminist scholars who have talked about this, the importance of acknowledging that that luxury of having to work inside the home was never accessible to a lot of women who were forced to work outside, are forced to maintain multiple jobs, are forced, and you can think about this in contemporary times but also in a historical case study if you wanted to examine that. Traditional family ideals assume that private and public space are uniquely divided. So that means that the male is expected to go outside of the public space, and the female or the feminine subject is considered to stay and remain within the domestic space inside the home. This structure is supposedly representative of how biological structures are also shaped. So, this is is um, what I mean when I say biological determinism is that this idea of family is presumed to exist based on the idea that everyone has heterosexual attraction and has the um, goal of reproduction. So, this is how scholarship by feminist thinkers has developed these different relationships between private and public space in relation to this notion of family. Also, the systems of private and public space are organized through a state sanctioned heterosexual marriage, which means that these systems become legitimized through matrimony. By marrying someone, you reproduce children, and these children are expected to pass down the biological line and continue to reproduce within this normative understanding of family structures. It is the ideal system of family that was produced and created to develop racial projects. So, Patricia Hill Collins and other scholars talk about how this idea of family domesticity is uniquely developed to further racial agendas, white supremacist racial agendas. The traditional family ideal consists of social institutions and social policies, which means that family structures develop other parts of the society. So families develop entertainment centers, family systems develop educational centers, they develop neighborhood um, mandates. All of these things are determined by family structures. A big aspects of society are determined by these ideas of family and these heterosexual systems, which there is a male and a female, and this is considered the ideal family structure. This ideal family structure is used by countries and nations to build concepts of national well being. And this is really important to tie all of this together. Um, family is considered a true biological entity. Um, it creates particular geographies. So, we see racially segregated neighborhoods are conceptualized as imagined families, where certain neighborhoods become the so called system of a family, right? But they also represent other ties and relationships to one another that are created to maintain supremacist and imperialist um, forces and systems within that society and within that structure. So the US, and particularly in previous campaigns that we've seen in the last several years, we see this notion of family really being mobilized. So one of the concepts that we talk about briefly in this course is abolition. And we've talked a little bit about the history of abolition and um, 21st century concepts of abolition differ from early uses of this term. And one of the concepts that we use to think about this is how abolition can help to imagine systems outside of what we're normatively used to and think that have become naturalized. So, for example, family in the sort of normative hegemonic understanding, it has origins from slavery. It is biologically determined. It usually denotes heterosexual concepts, and while there are and exist many representations that are not this, this is supposedly the ideal family structure. And also, a family is acknowledged by the nation state through policies and systems of recognition, school systems, banking accounts, restaurants, entertainment centers. All of these redefine and reaffirm the family structure. And I put this binary here not to say that uh, this is good or this is bad, but to show you that queer feminist scholars and specifically queer of color scholarship has really messed a lot with this term of family and really tried to move away from biological determination, heterosexuality, and these normative conceptualizations of family. And we'll talk a lot about why this is. But a lot of queer communities and queer scholars refer to kin and family structures to relate to people outside of their actual biological ties. A lot of times, queer youth and queer sex workers, people impacted by HIV, AIDS, all of these communities have historically been forced outside of their traditional family structures, which allows for different systems to develop where they are creating their own family structures. So these queer kin exist outside of biological kinship that rely on systems of interdependence rather than individuality. There's an understanding of collectivity, also accountability, as many of these systems and family structures created by particularly um, queer, trans, women of color are usually leading these households and providing a lot of the younger queer folks coming into these spaces necessary tools for survival. And a lot of these notions of family and queer communities are constantly resisting notions of nationalism. But we see that a lot of times they also are integrated into uh, war, military, and American supremacy. For example, a lot of times we see representation in army uh, and marine and forces where they have representations of queer couples to show inclusivity. But a lot of this can be problematic because while there may be acknowledging hetero relationships outside of heteronormative standards, they are continuously reifying other forms of violence. Um, so this is one of the things to think about, right? That liberalism tends to uh, use these notions of queer liberation for their own political agendas. And we will talk about, we've talked a little bit about Marsha P. Johnson and the Stonewall Uprising and things like that. But I think that as we get through the semester, you'll develop an understanding of um, these concepts and how a lot of queer of color critique really challenges a lot of mainstream feminist understandings of family. Family also really is critical to projects of citizenship. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next few weeks when we discuss the type of tropes that are used within immigrant rights initiatives. We constantly hear these notions of breaking up families or keep families together. And I really want you to think about why these rhetorics are used. But within citizenship, naturalized hierarchies within family structures are what construct US national identity. So the household leader, the father, the mother, all of these symbols become critical for nation building. And Patricia Hill Collins builds a lot of this throughout her work. But I want us to move now to engage with a separate section that also relates to this week's readings, as you'll understand when you read the Anne Fasto Sterling piece, is that this notion of family is really not just uh, problematized or critiqued in terms of 1 second. So as I was saying, so this notion of family is also relates to this sex and gender binary, and we're gonna talk about that here in just a minute. Um, it's freezing for some reason, so I'm gonna have to just show this. Okay. So the a scholar by the name of Thomas Hunt Morgan, in The Sex Itself, you will be watching a documentary this week on YouTube called Intersection. And you'll understand a little bit more once you watch that film and watch this lecture, how this is related to this notion of family. But I want to quote a section from this piece where Thomas Hunt says, in this analysis of this book, The Sex Itself, which is not a reading that you were expected to read, but I'm going to be basing this lecture off of this piece. It states, as this book shows, the X and Y chromosomes, little symbols of unbreachable sex dimorphism, came to anchor a conception of sex as a biologically fixed and unalterable binary, the very conception pre-mentioned by Morgan's Sex Itself. So we're going to talk about what that means. So genetic binary is this notion of X and Y chromosomes. So called males are those who have an extra X chromosome, so XXY, and so called females have only one X, and in the 1950s, this was determined. A critical concept to this, and a lot of this is discussed by feminist science studies scholars. This piece titled Sex Itself is a book that you can also access through your Rutgers library. But this is all coming from this branch of feminist science studies. And at the time, what was a critical component to developing these understandings about the genetic binary and the X and Y chromosomes was the Human Genome Project, which was happening in the 1950s. The Human Genome Project was an international scientific research project that had the goal of determining the sequence of nucleotide base pairs that make up human DNA and identifying and mapping all of the genes of the human genome from both a physical and functional standpoint. So, here is where this understanding of race and projects around race and eugenics and racial determination through biology develops into conceptualizations of gender. This project specifically led to scientific pursuits of understanding the genes and chromosomes of so called biological sex. So, a lot of times in this book, in this essay, the author talks about how the X chromosome is usually gendered through pronoun usage of she is, or used and referred to within a feminine pronoun, the category of sociable, controlling, conservative, motherly, big sister. These are all identifying categories or identifying characteristics that align with the X chromosome. And this is what the author is critiquing. And is critiquing in Hunt's argument. I'm sorry. The Y chromosome here is supposedly imagined as the masculine form. The words that are used to describe the Y chromosome are macho, active, player, dominant, and all of these tropes are portrayals of X and Y as a heterosexual couple with opposite and complementary gender roles. The other trope that she identifies is that the sex chromosome biology is often imagined as a war between the sexes. And I'm sure that many of you have seen different concepts, different interpretations, music, all of this is a common narrative that you've probably been exposed to. The additional thing is that sex chromosome researchers provide the X and Y symbols of maleness and femaleness with which we are supposed to identify and take pride in. In other words, these so called chromosomes are what determine maleness and femaleness, and these become buried with filled with cultural meanings and understandings about what it means to take and identify and feel pride with certain gender categories and expressing maleness and femaleness. One of the key problems of the Human Genome Project was that it relied on dangerous notions of human difference. So, in other words, racial science. It was basically eugenics, which is scientific approaches to build arguments about racial inferiority amongst Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in comparison to white normative biologies, abled bodies that were considered to be superior. So, using science to prove these claims. And at the time, the human genome was relying on a lot of these legacies of scientific approaches that really continue to shape contemporary practices of science and medicine. Um, One of the key things that the author brings to light in this discussion is she asks, okay, but race and what about gender? What about the history of sexual science? And what about genetic research on sex and gender? She asks all of these questions to show how race is also, that gender and race are both intimately tied to each other in terms of um, how science is used to um, validify uh, racial difference and racial superiority. So there are several different approaches that people have taken to understand these different chromosomes, but feminist science scholars are critical of what determines sex, right? And there's an ambiguous relationship between X, Y, and sex because it's not necessarily studied and only has been recently studied in the last few decades. Because a lot of the binary thinking also impacts scientific understandings. So these ambiguous relationships continue to be ambiguous because of the um, pre pre presumed ideologies that exist within science already. So, one of the key arguments that this author proposes that there is nothing essential about the X and Y in relation to femaleness or maleness. So, there's nothing that makes them inherently tied to being feminine or being male. Uh, Chromosomes are only one form of sex determining mechanism in the natural world. For example, birds, fruit, flies, these have all of these sentient beings have different ways of relating to each other and have different um, sex determining processes that are impacted by their environment. And she talks about turtles and reptiles and how their sex anatomy it develops in relation to the temperatures that they are in. Other species have one sex, while others have more than three, or change sex more than once in their lifetime. But this all depends on arrangement, exposure of environmental factors, and both. And you see this chart here that says anthropocentrism, pathocentrism, biocentrism, and holism. All of this graph here or this diagram here is meant to show you that a lot of our understandings about sex and gender are based off of our human experience. And this is specific to this notion of anthropocentrism, which is this concept the that focuses on human beings, on the state of being human, on personhood. This is supposedly the times that we are in, that we are living in. This emphasis on human experience and human understandings, um, and not considering other forms of understanding that would be related to other animals, all living things, and spaces, existence. So, one of the key feminist theorists, Gail Rubin, actually provides three principal components, an argument around the three principal components of Western ideology. She's critiquing this and says male and female, masculine and feminine, are complementary and binary. This is one of the key normative approaches that we see. This so called binary of public and private spheres, active and passive, rational, emotional, these binaries are all tied to one another and represent this concept of gender difference. the other key principle is this constant conflict and antagonism that supposedly characterizes this relationship between male and female, masculine, feminine, as a constant relationship of conflict. And then finally, it represents a biological assignment of sex, and the social category of gender are completely merged. So, in other words, differences between men and women are seen as a direct result of the individual, biologically determined, universal, and natural. Male equals masculine, and female equals feminine. So, these are some of the three most prominent Western understandings of sex and gender. Feminist science studies scholars like Anne Fausto Sterling have done a lot of work to develop a scientific approach to understanding. And we talk about this, she talks a little bit about this in her reading that you're engaged with this week, where she talks about there's five different layers that actually contribute to the sexual designation of a body. And these five different layers don't always necessarily align with one another. And studies about this are rarely engaged with because it's still a subject that we know very little about. But a lot of work has been happening in the last 5 years, specifically in the last decade, to really build understandings around this. Um, so you're going to be watching this film, Intersection, and you're going to be answering the questions about the film and how it relates, how each of the testimonies and personal stories that are discussed relate to all of the concepts that we discussed in this lecture. Um, One of the questions that you're going to be answering is, what is this notion or concept of intersectionality, and how does this relate to the sex binary and gender binary? And um, we're going to talk more about thinking about intersexuality not just as this unique experience that is only happens to a few people, but as a, a concept and an experience that is rarely engaged with in feminist scholarship. That's pretty much all that I have for you today. If you have any questions about the readings, the lectures, please feel free to send me an email. I look forward to reading all of your responses. I'm still working through some of the gradings from the grades from last week, reviewing responses. So thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to reading your work this week as well. Thank you.